Dust swirled at the edge of Willow Creek's lone train station as Caroline Fletcher stepped onto the rough wooden platform, each hand gripping a small child by the wrist. Her breath caught at the sight of a desert sun, setting behind jagged mountains, turning the sky into a blaze of pink and gold. She'd come 1,000 miles from her cramped Boston boarding house, with nothing but 2 trunks, her 5-year-old twins, and a hopeful heart. This was supposed to be her new beginning, a mail-order marriage to a rancher who promised stability and a home. But in the hush of that dusty twilight, trouble loomed larger than any promise ever could. Caroline Fletcher had never truly known the meaning of home. Born in a small village outside Philadelphia, she lost her father early on to a factory accident. Raised by a sickly mother who succumbed to pneumonia when Caroline was barely in her teens, she'd spent her youth shuffling between relatives and working as a seamstress. By the time she turned 20, Caroline had married a traveling salesman named James Billings, a man whose restlessness matched the flicker in her own heart. Soon after their wedding, she realized how fleeting their stability was. James died tragically of influenza 2 years later, leaving Caroline with twin boys, Abel and Aaron, and very few means to support them. The city of Boston was no place for a single mother with no stable employment. Sensing the walls closing in, Caroline found an advertisement in a tattered newspaper: "Prosperous rancher seeks loyal wife. Christian values, stable home, financial security." The rancher, a Mr. Tobias Harding from Willow Creek, Wyoming territory, offered the promise of a better life. Their correspondence started out formal, but quickly became personal. Tobias mentioned farmland stretching for miles, a big house he built, with his own hands, neighbors like Mrs. Lavinia Montclair, a widow, who ran the local boarding house, and a meager but devout congregation in the tiny local church. He insisted he wanted a wife to share in his prosperity, someone with a gentle heart. But in all those letters, Caroline never mustered the courage to mention her twins. She feared that sharing she was a mother of 2 might scare Tobias off. After all she'd heard of many men refusing single mothers, not wanting the burden of another man's children, she prayed that once he got to know her goodness, the children would be accepted as part of the package. Perhaps it was naive, but desperation often cloaked itself in hope. So with trembling hands, she wrote back in her neat script describing her modest upbringing, her cooking skills, and her devotion to faith. She sprinkled the truth with gentle half-truths, omitting the biggest detail: her boys. Tobias's next letters were brimming with anticipation. He spoke of needing a partner to help with the ranch's expansion, to fill his cavernous house with warmth, and to attend the dances at Willow Creek's monthly socials. Caroline felt her heart lighten with each pen stroke. Could this be the life she'd hoped for? A house, a family, a man who might care for her, and so arrangements were made. Tobias sent the fare for the train. Caroline sold what little she had to buy proper traveling clothes and boarded the train to Willow Creek. The twins clutched at her sides, excited to see the western frontier. She whispered to them every night, "We're going to a place where you'll have a yard to run in and fresh air to breathe." Her own anxiety churned like a thunderstorm, but she pressed on, fueled by the dream that perhaps this time her life would be stable, maybe even joyful. The train's brakes screeched against the rails as they chugged into Willow Creek Station. Caroline stepped out, the boys wide-eyed at the dusty main street lined with wooden storefronts and a single saloon. The station master tipped his hat, addressing her politely before hauling her 2 large trunks onto the platform. Dust devils spun in the distance across a wide, sun-scorched valley dotted with cacti and tumbleweeds. She could taste grit on her tongue, a stark contrast to the salty sea air she'd left behind on the East Coast. Tobias Harding wasn't there to greet her. Instead, she found a tall, lean man in a weathered hat, his face sun-leathered but kindly enough. He introduced himself as Alexander Myers, the ranch hand at Harding's spread. "Miss Fletcher," he asked, tipping his hat awkwardly. "Mr. Harding sent me to fetch you." Caroline felt a pang of disappointment that her future husband hadn't come himself, but she mustered a polite smile. She introduced him to Abel and Aaron, who clung shyly to her skirt. Alexander's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly at the sight of two children. She pretended not to notice. They loaded the boys' trunks and Caroline into a buckboard wagon. As they drove through the sleepy town, Caroline noted the storefronts, a mercantile with a sign reading McGinty's General Store, a humble smithy, a small church with whitewashed walls. Curious onlookers peered from windows or doorways. This was clearly the biggest news of the day. The wagon rattled onto a dirt road leading away from the heart of town. Caroline looked out, taking in the wide expanse of prairie fences and pockets of wild sage. Her pulse quickened. Somewhere out here lay her new life. The Harding Ranch sprawled over gentle hills, a wooden gate marking the entrance with a bold H carved into it. Horses roamed lazily in corrals, and a row of cattle grazed beyond a low fence. The main house was indeed large, built of timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that offered shade from the brutal sun. Even from the driveway, Caroline could sense the lonely grandeur of the place. Standing on that porch, with arms folded across his chest, stood Tobias Harding. He was around 40, older than Caroline had expected, with streaks of silver in his brown hair and a stern set to his jaw. He wore clean trousers and a polished belt buckle, a sign of a man who valued appearances. Caroline's heart fluttered with a mix of nerves and anticipation as Alexander pulled up the wagon. She gently coaxed her twins down, smoothed her dust-ridden skirts, and approached Tobias with a trembling smile. "Mr. Harding," she said, offering her hand politely. He didn't extend his hand. Instead, his gaze slid past her, landing squarely on the boys. Caroline cleared her throat, and sensing the tension, hurried to explain. "Tobias, sir, these are my sons, Abel and Aaron. How old are they?" he cut in, voice cold. "5, she answered, a tremor in her voice. She tried to keep her tone steady. I know I did not mention them in my letters, and for that I must apologize. But you have to understand." He held up a hand, and his expression hardened. "I asked for a wife, Miss Fletcher, not an entire family. My advertisement said nothing about children. You should have been honest from the start." A knot tightened in Caroline's stomach. She cast a glance at her boys, who stood quietly, trying to comprehend that their new home was not so welcoming. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Please, Mr. Harding, we had nowhere else to go. I didn't want to frighten you off. My children are well-behaved, bright, and full of potential. If you give us a chance, you'll see." Tobias inhaled deeply, looking from the ranch house to Caroline, and then back to the twins. Alexander stood off to the side, hat in hand, awkwardly silent. Finally, Tobias spoke. "I'll put you up in the house for the night, but we need to talk this through in the morning. I'm not sure I can uphold our agreement under these conditions." Caroline's stomach dropped. She had gambled everything, her money, her dreams, her children's future, on Tobias Harding. Now it teetered precariously on the edge of heartbreak. But she forced herself to nod. "Yes, sir. We'll talk in the morning." That first dinner in the Harding house was fraught with tension. Tobias barely spoke, except to ask for the salt. Abel and Aaron, picking up on the uncomfortable atmosphere, tried to be on their best behavior, yet the presence of children seemed to grate on Tobias's nerves. That night, Caroline tucked them into a spare bedroom, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She prayed for a miracle she wasn't sure would come. Morning arrived with the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of fresh coffee. Caroline awoke early, dressed the boys in their nicest clothes, and went downstairs to the dining table, where Tobias had already set out some biscuits and scrambled eggs. The tension from the night before lingered like an invisible storm cloud. Alexander Myers, the ranch hand, had already left to check on the livestock. Caroline tried to quell her nerves and sipped her coffee. Tobias cleared his throat. "Miss Fletcher, I have to be straightforward. This arrangement isn't what I signed up for. I expected a wife who could work the ranch, help me with finances, and share a life with me. I have no interest in taking on 2 children that are not mine." Her heart twisted painfully. "I understand your shock, but I assure you we can make this work. I promise to handle everything that concerns my boys. They won't be a burden." Tobias shook his head resolutely. "I've spent decades building up this land after my father died. I'm not unkind, Miss Fletcher, but I also need someone who can focus on the ranch and on me. You are not that woman. I'm sorry you traveled so far, but I can't, in good conscience, continue with any marriage promise." He paused, his voice growing softer, but no less firm. "I'm a man of my word, so I'll offer you a room here until you get your affairs in order. But I can't marry you." Caroline felt as though the ground vanished beneath her feet. She struggled to maintain composure. "How long might that be?" she asked quietly. "A couple of weeks, until you find a way back east or somewhere else," he said, shrugging. The conversation ended abruptly when Abel and Aaron walked in. Tobias forced a tight smile, then excused himself to go tend to chores. Caroline watched his retreating form through the window and felt her tears slip down her cheeks. She had nowhere to go, no more money for another train ticket. The children sensed her distress, but said nothing, only climbed into her lap for comfort. Word traveled fast in Willow Creek. Within a day, news that the mail-order bride had arrived with children and that Tobias Harding had refused her spread like wildfire. When Caroline ventured into town to buy a spool of thread from McGinty's general store, she felt the townspeople's stares like sharp pins against her back. She heard hushed whispers of "poor woman" and "those little ones," and even she deceived him. Shame and worry coiled inside her, but she tried to keep her chin high. Alexander Myers, the ranch hand, seemed to be the only friendly face. He carried her parcels, offered to watch the twins while she conducted errands, and generally tried to make her feel less like an outcast. "Don't mind the gossip," he told her one afternoon. "Folks here have little else to talk about. They'll move on soon enough." But Caroline wasn't sure. She'd become the novelty of the town, a rumor to be passed over poker tables in the saloon. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the question of her future. Tobias had given her 2 weeks. She had to do something. One of the highlights of Willow Creek life was the monthly church social, an evening of music, dancing, and potluck dishes where families from miles around gathered. Despite her uncertain position, Caroline decided to attend. Perhaps she'd meet someone who could offer her work, or at the very least, she could show the town she wasn't the deceiver they believed her to be. She dressed the twins in their best shirts, tying small bow ties around their collars. She wore a simple grey gown, modest and neat, her hair pinned in a loose bun. Walking into the modest wooden church hall, she felt all eyes turn upon her. Immediately, people parted ways, some looking sympathetic, others curious. Caroline forced a smile and guided Abel and Aaron toward the tables laden with pies, fried chicken, and bowls of mashed potatoes. That's when she spotted her Mrs. Lavinia Montclair, the widow who ran a local boarding house. In her late 40s, Lavinia was a striking woman with a regal bearing, her hair swept back in a tidy chignon. She wore a dark purple satin dress, and on her face lingered an expression of both curiosity and concern. Caroline recognized her from a mention in Tobias's letters, so she approached, introduced herself, and was surprised by the warmth in the woman's greeting. "Caroline, my dear, I was wondering if I'd get a chance to meet you. Word around town is that you arrived under unfortunate circumstances." Lavinia's voice was low, empathetic. Caroline's cheeks burned. "Yes, I suppose everyone knows by now." Lavinia's eyes flicked toward the twins who clung to Caroline's skirt. "They are handsome boys, and well-behaved, I see." She bent down and offered them each a piece of taffy. Abel and Aaron, hungry for a friendly face, accepted with shy smiles. "Thank you," Caroline murmured. "I'm praying for a way to earn enough to support them. I can sew, cook, clean. Anything. I just can't remain at Tobias's ranch much longer." Lavinia nodded sympathetically. "Willow Creek's a small place, but folks do need help from time to time. I might have a proposition, actually. Come see me at the boarding house tomorrow afternoon. We'll chat." Caroline breathed a sigh of relief, a faint glimmer of hope. The next afternoon, Caroline walked the short distance to Lavinia Montclair's boarding house, a tidy place with whitewashed walls, green shutters, and a wraparound porch adorned by flower boxes. Inside the parlor was furnished with plush armchairs and a sturdy piano, giving the place an air of gentle refinement. Lavinia welcomed her warmly and ushered her to a seat. "I'll come straight to the point," Lavinia said, offering tea. "I've run this boarding house alone since my husband passed 5 years ago. We had no children, so it's been just me, plus the occasional helper. But my arthritis has gotten worse. I need someone to manage the daily tasks, cooking, cleaning laundry, greeting guests. In return, you'll have a place to stay." Caroline's heart soared, but caution made her voice tremble. That's very generous. But I have 2 children. They're welcome here," Lavinia interjected, smiling kindly. "There's an attic room that's spacious enough for you and your boys. You'll have your privacy. I can't offer you a big salary, but enough to buy what you need and set a little aside. And you won't have to pay rent." Tears sprang to Caroline's eyes, and she clasped Lavinia's hand. "Thank you. This is more than I could have prayed for." "There is, however, something else," Lavinia said softly, her tone turning grave. "I want to be honest with you, Caroline. I'm not just offering you work. In many ways, I need a companion, not just to run the boarding house, but to share life with. This place can be lonely. And there's something else, something about me the town doesn't quite understand." Caroline tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Lavinia paused, drawing in a breath as though gathering courage. "When my husband died, I was left with some measure of wealth enough to keep me comfortable. But heartbreak, it changes a person. I do not wish to remarry a man. It's not that I can't, it's that I don't want to. Men have tried to court me, seeing my financial stability, but I have no interest in them. And in this town that sets tongues wagging." Caroline felt a stirring of empathy. She, too, had lost a husband and knew how that could hollow a person. She reached out and touched Lavinia's hand gently. "I've known heartbreak, too." Lavinia searched Caroline's eyes. "This is a small town, Caroline. People talk, and if you come to live under my roof, they'll talk about you too. They'll say the widow Montclair is trying to fill her home with someone else's family, or that she's found a woman to do her bidding, or heaven knows what else. Are you ready for that kind of talk?" Caroline thought about the harsh stares, the gossip she'd already endured. "I don't care what they say. My children need a home, and I'm grateful for your kindness." Lavinia exhaled, her expression relieved. "Then it's settled. Move in whenever you're ready." Caroline returned to the Harding Ranch that evening, her spirit buoyed by the promise of a new beginning. She found Tobias in the barn, tending to a sick mare. Gathering her resolve, she waited until he wiped his hands clean of hay and grime. "Tobias," she began in a controlled voice, "I wanted to let you know I've found work in town. I'll be leaving your house tomorrow morning." He gave her a slight nod, not meeting her eyes. "I wish you well, and I'm glad you found a place. I'm sorry things didn't work out." She waited, half hoping for a last shred of kindness. He stared at the barn floor, his boots scuffing the dirt. "I suppose," she said softly, "we both know it's for the best." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned to pick up a brush for the mare, effectively dismissing her. Caroline swallowed her disappointment, reminded herself she owed him nothing. The man she had hoped to marry was a stranger now, and this new path, though unexpected, felt strangely liberating. The next morning, Alexander Myers gave Caroline and the boys a ride into town with the trunks. He offered a sympathetic smile as he helped haul them up to Lavinia's porch. "If you ever need help with anything, just let me know," he said quietly. Caroline thanked him, touched by his kindness. Lavinia greeted them with open arms, showing the twins their new attic bedroom. It was cozy, with 2 small beds and a chest of drawers for their clothes. Sunlight poured in through a single window, and the boys immediately began exploring. Caroline's own sleeping area was just beyond a small partition, separated by a wooden screen, for some privacy. As the days passed, Caroline learned the rhythms of the boarding house. Rising at dawn, she'd stoke the kitchen fire, brew coffee, and prepare breakfast for Lavinia and any guests renting a room. Then she'd tidy up, change linens, sweep floors, wash laundry. Her sewing skills proved valuable for repairing torn sheets and curtains. Sometimes the twins helped gather kindling or fetch water, delighting in simple tasks that made them feel grown. Lavinia, for her part, took Caroline under her wing. She taught her about the local plants, the best places to buy fresh produce, and even how to handle the town's gossip. Gradually, what started as a purely practical arrangement blossomed into genuine friendship. They shared stories of their lost husbands by the hearth at night, the quiet hours punctuated by laughter or tears, each memory forging a deeper bond. Still, the town talked. Some insisted Caroline had used Lavinia's generosity, while others speculated that the widow Montclair had finally found a replacement for her late husband, an outlandish rumor that said more about their imaginations than reality. Caroline tried to ignore it, focusing on her work and her children. With time, Willow Creek's attention drifted to other dramas, a saloon brawl here, a dispute over cattle boundaries there. Caroline's situation became old news. She found a measure of peace, yet an undercurrent of unease remained. Tobias Harding had humiliated her publicly, yes, but she sensed that behind his stoic veneer, something still simmered. The shame of being the man who rejected his mail-order bride lingered in the townspeople's memory. On top of that, Alexander Myers still dropped by from time to time, offering a friendly word or picking up supplies for the ranch, inadvertently linking Caroline to Tobias's name in the local grapevine. One day, while shopping for flour at McGinty's, Caroline overheard 2 women gossiping about Tobias. "He started courting Harriet Loomis," one whispered. Harriet was a young schoolteacher known for her gentle nature. "I guess he's trying to fix his reputation. It's not easy to live down, turning away that poor mother and her twins." Caroline felt a pang of residual hurt, but also relief. Tobias was moving on. Perhaps this would finally bury the past. Summer rolled into Willow Creek with blazing heat. The boarding house remained busy catering to traveling salesmen and the occasional family passing through. One evening, a commotion erupted just outside the saloon across the street. Caroline peered through the boarding house window, heart pounding, as she watched a ragged man stagger and shout, apparently inebriated. Alexander Myers, who had just left the boarding house, attempted to calm the drunk, but the confrontation escalated. A drunken punch was thrown, striking Alexander in the jaw. Alexander retaliated, forcing the man to the ground. In an instant, the sheriff was there, pulling them apart. Worried, Caroline rushed outside to see if Alexander was hurt. Blood trickled from a split lip. She insisted on taking him back into the boarding house to clean the wound. In the small parlor, she dabbed his lip gently with a damp cloth, as Lavinia looked on. "You didn't have to intervene," Caroline said, voice wavering. "He could have hurt you." Alexander shrugged, wincing slightly. "Couldn't let him keep causing trouble. Besides, it's part of my job to keep the peace in a way. Tobias relies on me to represent the ranch well." Caroline paused, meeting Alexander's earnest gaze. His quiet kindness was a balm to her wounded pride, a stark contrast to Tobias's rejection. "I appreciate it," she murmured. "It was brave." Alexander's cheeks reddened, and he averted his eyes. "I'm just doing what any good man would do. You deserve better than the treatment you've had." A mixture of gratitude and something else fluttered in Caroline's chest. "Thank you, Alexander." Weeks turned into months. Lavinia and Caroline found a comfortable rhythm each day, marked by chores, laughter, and shared confidences. The twins thrived under the relative stability, forging friendships with other children in town, and often playing by the small creek behind the boarding house. One moonlit evening, Caroline and Lavinia sat on the porch after the guests had turned in, sipping tea in companionable silence. The summer air was cooler now, the wind carrying the scent of juniper. Lavinia broke the stillness with a quiet statement that took Caroline by surprise. "I've been thinking about your future, Caroline. The boys are growing. People talk. You've done so much for me for this boarding house. But is it enough to secure your place here long term? I worry about what might happen if my health worsens or if the boarding house falls on hard times." Caroline lowered her gaze. "I try not to think too far ahead, but sometimes I can't help it. If something happened to you, Lavinia, I'd lose not just a home, but my source of income." Lavinia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Which is why I have a proposition, though it might seem unorthodox. Marry me." Caroline nearly dropped her teacup. "Pardon," Lavinia's eyes glistened with determination. "I told you before, I have no interest in another husband. But a marriage between us would grant you security. It would make you an equal partner in this boarding house. If something were to happen to me, the place would legally be yours. You and the boys would never have to worry about being uprooted again." Shock, confusion, gratitude, and a swirl of other emotions washed over Caroline. But how would that even work? We're both women. Surely the law wouldn't recognize such a thing, especially not here in the Wyoming territory. "Wyoming has fewer restrictions than most places," Lavinia said quietly. "But you're right. It would be unconventional in the eyes of many. We would need to keep it discreet. Yet some folks here in Willow Creek turn a blind eye to things if it isn't causing trouble. More importantly, it's a union of mutual benefit. It doesn't need to be romantic for it to serve both our needs." Caroline's mind reeled. Could she truly enter into a marriage of convenience with Lavinia Montclair, a woman who had shown her more compassion than any man in Willow Creek? What would the twins think? What would the town think? And yet the promise of security was so enticing. I need to think about it, Caroline whispered. Lavinia reached across and squeezed her hand. Take your time. I'm not pressuring you. Just know that I care for you and the boys deeply. You've brought life back into this home, Caroline. I'd do anything to keep you here. Caroline nodded, tears welling up as she realized that in many ways Lavinia had already given her a stable family. Could a marriage paper truly make it any more real than it already felt? Caroline spent several nights tossing and turning, haunted by Lavinia's proposal. In a sense, it wasn't so different from a mail-order marriage, an arrangement driven by necessity rather than romance. And yet this time, the arrangement offered her children a guaranteed home, a mother figure who cared for them, and a partnership with a strong, capable woman. There was no deception, no hiding. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Would she be subjecting the twins to a life of gossip and scorn? Could she live with the constant sideways glances from the townspeople? One evening, she was sitting by the creek, watching the boys skip stones, when Alexander Myers rode by. He reined in his horse and dismounted, offering a warm smile. Mind if I sit? She nodded, and he settled beside her on the creek bank. For a while, they watched the twins squeal with delight, each time a stone hopped across the water. Then Alexander quietly asked, "You doing all right? There's been talk, some say. Miss Montclair proposed something unusual." Caroline's cheeks heated. The entire town seemed to feed off gossip like vultures. She wrapped her arms around her knees. "She offered me a chance to remain here permanently. She wants to protect me and the boys, and I appreciate her kindness more than I can say." Alexander fiddled with a blade of grass. "I've heard some men say cruel things about her. They claim she's after your virtue, that she's—" Caroline's tone sharpened. "I won't hear it. Lavinia is a kind, generous soul." He raised his hands. "I'm not accusing. I just worry about you, that's all. I know how vicious this town can be. If you ever need a friend—" She looked over, and the sincerity in his eyes made her heart throb with gratitude. Alexander was as gentle as Tobias had been callous, but the lines were blurred. She didn't know if his concern was purely platonic or if there was some deeper interest behind it. "Thank you," she said softly. "I do consider you a friend, Alexander." He nodded, then got up and dusted off his pants. "I'll let you be then. But if ever you need anything, you know where to find me." And with that, he rode away, leaving Caroline alone with her thoughts. The next morning, Caroline found Lavinia in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread. The aroma of yeast and flour filled the warm air. Caroline gently took over the kneading, letting her hands work the dough as Lavinia wiped her brow. "What you said," Caroline began, voice barely above a whisper, "about marrying you, I've decided. If you'll still have me, I accept." Lavinia's eyes lit with relief. "Are you certain?" Caroline nodded firmly. "I won't lie and say I don't have fears. But what you offer is more than I ever dreamed possible. A safe home for me and my children, and a partnership built on respect. That's more than most women get, even in a traditional marriage." Lavinia set her hand atop Caroline's flower-streaked one. "You won't regret this." They embraced, a hug laden with gratitude, mutual support, and a hint of apprehension about the world outside. Arranging a formal ceremony for two women in the late 19th century was, of course, out of the question, so they opted for a small, private vow exchange in the parlor of the boarding house, witnessed only by the twins. Lavinia's attorney from a neighboring town discreetly drew up papers, granting Caroline half ownership of the boarding house and a life interest in the property should Lavinia die first. Everything was done quietly, without fanfare. The only outward sign of something unusual was that Caroline began wearing a simple silver band on her left hand, a ring Lavinia had once worn in memory of her husband. Word still got out. Willow Creek's rumor mill churned anew, but the novelty of it soon wore off. Some folks muttered that Lavinia was a fool, others admired her generosity, and still others whispered that the widow Montclair had strange tastes. But with no direct proof and no public vow, there was little the town could do. Caroline was in practice Lavinia's family, and for the most part they left them in peace. Life took on a surprisingly normal cadence. Caroline managed the daily operations, while Lavinia handled finances and greeted arrivals. The twins slept soundly at night, free from the uncertainty that had once shadowed their days. Sometimes they called Lavinia Aunt Lavinia, a term she wore with pride. On Sundays, they all attended the small church, though the congregation often eyed them with subdued disapproval. Yet no one dared to openly confront them, given Lavinia's contributions to the church and local charities. Meanwhile, Tobias Harding went about his life. On rare occasions, when Caroline saw him in town, he avoided her gaze. Harriet Loomis and Tobias appeared side by side at church events, fueling speculation they might marry soon. Caroline found that she no longer cared. Her heart had found a different path, one bound not by romantic love, but by loyalty, friendship, and stability. Alexander Myers remained a quiet ally, sometimes dropping by with fresh produce from the ranch, or offering to help fix squeaky floorboards. Caroline sensed he was grappling with his own feelings about her. Perhaps in another life, if circumstances had been different, they might have tried for a courtship, but she was bound to Lavinia now by choice and necessity. One autumn day, a traveling circuit judge arrived in Willow Creek to adjudicate a series of land disputes. Townspeople were abuzz, hoping to settle boundary lines and feuds. Quietly, Tobias Harding filed a claim against a neighbor for creek water rights. The neighbor fought back, and soon tensions rose, threatening the entire town with heated arguments. Caroline tried to avoid the drama, focusing on the boarding house. However, fate had other plans. A rumor began circulating that the judge was a strict conservative, with little tolerance for improper arrangements. Whispers said he might investigate Lavinia Montclair's household. Fear crept through Caroline. If the judge decided their living arrangement was unlawful, he could force them apart or stir enough trouble that they'd have no choice but to leave Willow Creek. The day of the hearing arrived. Dozens packed into the makeshift courtroom, a large barn on the outskirts of town. Caroline didn't attend, but Lavinia went to watch the proceedings. By dusk, it was reported that Tobias Harding had won his water rights case. The neighbor stormed out in fury, cursing Harding's name. Feeling drained, Lavinia was on her way home when she overheard the judge's conversation with some locals about the deviant living under Montclair's roof. She hurried back, breathless, bursting into the boarding house. "He knows about us," she whispered, pale with fear. "He claims it's immoral, that he might have cause to investigate for indecency. If word gets to the territorial court, we could face legal issues." Caroline's world tilted. She gathered the twins, who were already frightened by Lavinia's demeanor. "What are we to do?" Lavinia clutched Caroline's shoulders. "We stand our ground. The property is legally in both our names. We're not violating any specific law. But if he decides to make an example of us, it might get ugly." 2 days later, Judge Reginald Porter marched up the boarding house steps, accompanied by the sheriff. Lavinia and Caroline greeted them in the parlor, hearts pounding. "I've heard troubling reports," said the judge, a gaunt man with a severe mustache. "Two women living together, claiming to be joined in some form of union. This is not recognized by the law, nor is it moral by Christian standards. Caroline's voice shook. Sir, we share this home. That is all. We run a boarding house to serve travelers and to earn a living. We do no harm. The judge sniffed dismissively. And you have these children here. Where is the father? What sort of environment are they being raised in? Caroline opened her mouth to defend herself, but Lavinia placed a calm hand on her arm. Their father is deceased, Judge Porter, and their mother is more than capable of raising them. Porter frowned. Living arrangements like this are an affront to decency. If I had my way, I'd see you run out of Willow Creek. He turned to the sheriff. I want them monitored. Any sign of impropriety, you'll bring charges. The sheriff gave a small nod, visibly uncomfortable. Yes, sir. With that, the judge swept out, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Caroline sank into a chair, her mind spinning with dread. What do we do now? Lavinia straightened. We live our lives as we have. He can threaten, but he won't find a legal footing to remove us, not unless we give him cause. Caroline glanced at her sons, worry knitting her brow. All it takes is one malicious rumor to spark an investigation. And the children, I can't have them taken from me. Lavinia squeezed her hand. We'll protect each other, Caroline. Word of the judge's threat spread through Willow Creek. To Caroline's surprise, she found allies where she least expected. Alexander Myers stood by them, refusing to entertain any slander. Harriet Loomis, the schoolteacher, even approached Caroline at church to express support. Those children deserve stability, Harriet said quietly. I won't stand for any talk that might harm them. Despite these pockets of kindness, the judge still lurked, as though waiting for an opportunity. Tensions mounted when a traveling salesman staying at the boarding house spun a far-fetched tale after too many drinks in the saloon. He claimed to have witnessed unseemly behavior in the parlor late at night, though no one could corroborate his story. Still, it stirred suspicion. One afternoon, the sheriff knocked on the door again. This time, he came alone, hat in hand. I'm sorry to bother you, Miss Montclair. Miss Fletcher, he said, eyes downcast. The judge wants me to keep records of any suspicious activity. Caroline's voice trembled with frustration. Suspicious? Like what, two women cooking supper together? He offered an apologetic shrug. We both know how foolish this is, but he's got the power of the territorial circuit behind him. Just be careful. In late autumn, a fierce thunderstorm swept across Willow Creek, rattling windows and turning dirt roads into rivers of mud. On that tumultuous night, the judge's malicious intent finally erupted. He arrived at the boarding house unannounced, demanding to inspect the premises for indecent material. Rain pelted the windows as the twins cowered behind Caroline. I have the right, the judge declared, brandishing his authority. I suspect immoral behavior, cohabitation, that violates the moral code of this territory. Lavinia stood firm. You have no warrant and no standing to enter here. I know the law, Judge Porter. Get out of my home. The judge glowered, thunder booming behind him like a cosmic gavel. You defy me at your peril, Mrs. Montclair. I'll see you in jail if I must. Caroline trembled but moved beside Lavinia, the two forming a protective barrier in front of the twins. Just then, a lone figure appeared in the open doorway behind the judge. It was Tobias Harding, drenched from the storm. Judge, that's enough, Tobias growled. Surprising everyone. These women aren't breaking any laws. If you think they are, prove it in court, not by storming into their house at night. The judge spun around. Mr. Harding, this is none of your business. Tobias stepped inside, imposing. It is my business when you terrorize this town, harassing citizens without cause. I won't stand for it. He glanced at Lavinia and Caroline. I'll testify for them if you bring charges. that they run an honest boarding house, nothing more. Bristling, the judge slammed his walking stick on the floor. Fine, this isn't over, Harding. He turned to Lavinia, eyes burning with anger. I'll see you in court. Then he stormed out into the rain. In the sudden hush, Caroline found her voice. Why did you do that? You've never had any interest in my welfare before. Tobias sighed, heavily, water dripping from his hat. I'm not proud of how I treated you, Caroline, but I won't see innocent folks railroaded by a pompous fool. We have to stick together in Willow Creek, or we'll tear ourselves apart. Lavinia inclined her head in grudging respect. Thank you. With that, Tobias left, leaving everyone shaken by the judge's threat, yet oddly united by the injustice of his actions. Days passed without further incident. The judge remained in town, apparently gathering evidence. Lavinia consulted her attorney, who insisted the judge had no case unless someone came forward with testimony of actual unlawful behavior. The rumors were rumors, nothing more. Nevertheless, the stress was palpable. Caroline found herself jumping at every knock on the door, scanning faces for hidden malice. Lavinia tried to reassure her, but the tension was thick. The twins sensed it too, clinging to Caroline more often. One afternoon, Harriet Loomis arrived with a small casserole and a kind smile. I heard you might need some comfort. I also wanted to say that many of us in Willow Creek stand with you. The judge is out of line. Caroline gratefully accepted the dish and introduced Harriet to Lavinia. Over dinner, they discussed strategies for if the judge made good on his threat. Alexander Myers came by later, offering to gather a group of townspeople to testify to the boarding house's good reputation. Even Dr. Thomas Beckett, the local physician, promised to speak on their behalf. Slowly, Caroline realized how many supporters they had. The judge might be powerful, but the collective will of Willow Creek might stand stronger. At last, the day arrived. The judge summoned Lavinia Montclair and Caroline Fletcher to a hearing in the same barn-turned courtroom used for Tobias's water rights case. A crowd gathered, curious and divided. On one side, a few pious folk glared disapprovingly. On the other, a mix of ranchers, shopkeepers, and travelers who'd stayed at the boarding house watched anxiously. Judge Porter slammed his gavel. We are here to discuss allegations of immoral cohabitation and endangerment of minor children. Lavinia and Caroline stood before him, flanked by their attorney. Tobias Harding, Alexander Myers, Harriet Loomis, Dr. Beckett and others waited to offer testimony. Porter called a string of townspeople to the stand. Some delivered ambiguous remarks about the boarding house, but none could attest to any wrongdoing. The traveling salesman, who once spread rumors, had already left town. The judge tried to twist their words, but it was clear he had no tangible evidence. Caroline nearly sagged with relief when Harriet Loomis testified eloquently about the stable environment provided for the twins. Alexander Myers offered accounts of Caroline's unwavering devotion to her children and praised Lavinia's generosity. Even Tobias Harding, stoic at first, admitted that while he parted ways with Caroline over the issue of her children, I've never seen her or Mrs. Montclair act in any improper manner. Finally, the judge had no choice but to concede. Very well, I see no solid evidence to support charges. Case dismissed, he grumbled. Then, with a glare at Lavinia and Caroline, he added, but let it be known I disapprove of this arrangement. As the gavel struck, the tension broke. Relief flooded Caroline, tears of gratitude staining her cheeks. Lavinia embraced her, and the twins clapped, not fully understanding, but sensing the victory. Harriet Alexander and even Tobias offered smiles of congratulations. Caroline thought she glimpsed a hint of apology in Tobias's eyes, an unspoken acknowledgement that he'd finally done right by her in some small way. With the gavel's final strike still echoing in memory, Willow Creek slowly returned to its quieter rhythms. Judge Porter departed the very next day, his threats having crumbled under the weight of community testimony. In his absence, the air in town felt lighter, no longer charged with tension and suspicion. For Caroline, each sunrise now carried a softness she hadn't known in years. She awoke to the smell of Lavinia's herbal tea, the sound of her sons giggling upstairs, and the comforting hum of daily routine. The boarding house thrived like never before. Townsfolk who once whispered behind her back now greeted her with nods, and some even stopped to compliment her cooking or ask about room availability. The boarding house, once under scrutiny, had become a symbol of quiet endurance. Lavinia, too, seemed lighter. The persistent worry that had once pinched the corners of her eyes had eased. She and Caroline developed a rhythm that spoke of trust, built slowly, deliberately, brick by brick. On Sunday mornings, they walked side by side to church, with the boys between them. Some members still offered cool glances, but others had softened. A few even began leaving baked goods at the boarding house porch, small offerings of truce. The twins, now more secure than ever, began calling Lavinia Mama V. They helped set tables, told knock-knock jokes to the guests, and bragged that their boarding house was the best place west of the Mississippi. At night, when the lamps were turned low and the day's work was done, Caroline sometimes sat beside Lavinia on the porch swing. She would listen to the wind sweep through the prairie grass and think back on the road that had brought her here. The heartbreak, the risk, the resilience. In this quiet town, in a house built by grace and grit, Caroline had finally found peace, not the kind she imagined, but the kind she never dared hope for. Winter arrived in Willow Creek, draped in a soft hush, blanketing rooftops and fence posts with fresh snow. At the Montclair boarding house, warmth spilled from the windows, casting golden light across the porch and down the quiet street. Inside the parlor, buzzed with life. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, garlands of pine and holly lined the mantel, and the smell of cinnamon, roasted apples, and fresh gingerbread filled every room. Guests gathered around the piano, where Caroline played carols with practiced fingers, her voice soft but sure. Abel and Aaron, now nearly 6, darted between the adults, their cheeks flushed with excitement, laughter bubbling from their lips as they played with other children beneath the twinkling Christmas tree. Lavinia stood near the fire holding a cup of cider, her eyes quietly sweeping over the joyful scene. Every year she had hosted holiday gatherings, but none had ever felt quite like this. The house no longer echoed with solitude. It pulsed with the heartbeat of family. As the final note of Silent Night faded, Caroline looked up and met Lavinia's gaze across the room. Without a word, she rose and joined her by the fire. Lavinia reached for her hand, giving it a light squeeze. "We did it," she whispered, her voice tinged with awe. "Despite everything, we made it." Caroline's eyes misted as she nodded. This is more than I ever hoped for. Not just safety, not just shelter, but a true home." The firelight flickered across their faces, illuminating years of struggle and strength. Around them, the guests sang and laughed, unaware of the journey that had brought these 2 women and 2 little boys to this place of peace. And in that moment, with music in the air and hearts finally at rest, they knew gratitude had never felt so complete. And so, dear listeners, ends the Wild West drama of a mail-order bride who arrived in Willow Creek with twins, faced rejection from her would-be groom, yet found an unexpected proposal that forever changed her life. Caroline's journey reminds us that sometimes the most unconventional paths lead to the deepest sense of home. Lavinia's resolve to protect Caroline and her boys, and Caroline's courage to accept a new uncharted future, taught them and the entire town of Willow Creek that family is not always defined by tradition. If you found yourself captivated by this tale of resilience, hope, and the power of human connection, please show your support. Like this video, share it with friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you heartfelt stories that spark the imagination. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey